In 1963, James Jebbia was born in New York City, but he wouldn't remain there long. When he was just 1 year old, his father, an American-born member of the US Air Force, and his mother, an England native who worked as a schoolteacher, decided to move the family to the town of Crawley in West Sussex, England, about 30 miles south of London. So this is where James grew up, and while most aspects of his upbringing have been kept very private, there is one that is very public. When he was about 14 years old, he appeared in the long-running British television series Grange Hill as the character Tommy Watson. The show was about school children in London, and the best comparison I can think of here is that it was sort of like Saved by the Bell, except that the kids were younger and, of course, British. James only appeared in a handful of episodes, and as far as I'm aware, this was his first and last role on television, so it didn't exactly launch him to stardom. But in hindsight, there's something to be learned here. As we'll come to see later on, James has become notoriously reclusive and makes an active effort to stay out of the public eye, so to think that he once pursued an acting career seems entirely uncharacteristic. But my challenge to that is that this was actually the first hint that he was destined to pursue a career in the arts. While acting may not have been the correct path for him, he clearly had creative talent, and it would only be a matter of time before he found the correct outlet for it. But in the meantime, he was still figuring that out. After leaving the show, not much is known about James's teenage years, other than the fact that he was gradually becoming more and more aware of the burgeoning punk and streetwear movements in London. Specifically, he became an avid reader of the London-based ID magazine, and this had a significant impact on his taste in fashion and music, because it not only covered the most popular brands and musicians, but because it also put a spotlight on the ones that no one had ever heard of. In one issue, he'd be reading about avant-garde designers like Rei Kawakubo, and in the next, he'd be reading about a tiny shop in London selling rare vintage t-shirts. This was his introduction to the world of fashion, and he knew that he wanted to take part in it. But how he would take part in it wasn't clear just yet. So instead, he did what a lot of teenagers in his position do. He decided to get a job so that he could actually buy some of it. Willing to take whatever job he could get, he began working at a Duracell factory. Yes, you heard that correctly, Duracell, the battery company. As lackluster as this job may have been, to James it didn't matter. All he cared about was getting his paycheck and then taking it to the streetwear shops and boutiques in London where he could buy some of the pieces he'd been reading about. While he may not have realized it at the time, these trips to London were formative experiences for him. He was there to buy clothes, but in the process, he was getting a glimpse into how these shops operated, which shops carried the best pieces, which ones people were hanging out at, and what made them want to hang out there in the first place. This is important to note because as famous as James would someday become for his creative vision, he would arguably become even more famous for his innovative approach to business and marketing, something that we'll be talking about much more in just a bit. So for now, subconsciously storing these bits of information away for later use, James Jebbia quietly joined the fray of London's streetwear fanatics, and he felt at home there. But by the time that he was 19, he was getting an itch for something different. About 10 years earlier, his parents had gotten divorced, and his father had actually moved back to West Virginia in the United States. James would visit him from time to time, giving him a glimpse into what life in the United States was like, but in his magazines and from chatting at the local shops in London, he had been hearing a lot about this growing streetwear movement in New York City. So, in 1983, he took a leap of faith and decided to move there. Specifically, he moved to Staten Island. For those of you who may not be familiar, Staten Island is part of New York City, but it's not exactly what New York dreams are made of. It's physically separated from the other boroughs by a body of water, and to get into the city where the shops are, most people take the Staten Island ferry. He had picked Staten Island because he could afford to live there for just $500 a month, and the reason that I'm highlighting this is to emphasize that James's journey wasn't always glamorous. In the early days, he had to find ways to make things work just to give himself the opportunity to do what he wanted to do. But at the same time, that was the big question. What did he want to do? His first job was at a shop in Soho for a brand called Parachute. Parachute was actually a Montreal-based brand, and in a matter of years, it had quickly become quite popular, in large part thanks to Michael Jackson wearing one of their jackets. In 1980, they had opened their first location in New York, and this is where James would receive his crash course in fashion retail. Now, I'm specifying fashion retail for a very specific reason here, which is that if you look back at some of Parachute's designs, they don't exactly scream James Jebbia. The pieces were fairly avant-garde, and that's why they were perfect for onstage performers like Michael Jackson, or the handful of other stars known to have worn Parachute, like Madonna and Mick Jagger. So, and this is just me speculating, I think it's fair to say that James may have liked the designs, but that they weren't the reason he was there. What he was paying attention to was the retail side of things. How the store operated on a practical level, how the brand marketed itself, how it managed supply and demand, and all of those other things that we as consumers tend to take for granted. The manager of the store was named Morgan Allard, and James has gone on to say that he was a fantastic mentor for learning about all of these things. You see, Morgan was in many ways ahead of his time. And maybe the reason we can say that now is because the things that he taught James would become the future of fashion retail. His big idea was that running a successful retail business required creating a culture around that business. It was not enough to rent out a space and put cool clothing on the shelves. Every part of the experience mattered and had to be carefully curated. To that end, the first big decision he made as owner was to rent out a prime location in Soho that cost them about $6,500 a month. That was back in 1980, so when you factor in inflation, that would be about $25,000 a month in 2026. From a financial standpoint, this may not have been the wisest decision, but having the correct location mattered so much to Morgan that he was willing to roll the dice on it. The next big decision he made was to only hire people for the store that fit the brand image he was trying to achieve. Today, this is common practice, but you have to remember that back then, there was a much sharper divide between high-end fashion and all of the other punk/streetwear brands. It was a novel concept to hire a 19-year-old kid like James who would show up to work wearing a vintage graphic t-shirt and a pair of jeans to be the one selling your $1,000 designer jacket. But this had the desired effect of injecting this relatively high-end, conceptual label with a rebellious rock and roll vibe, thereby opening it up to an entirely new segment of consumers. So all told, this was a fantastic learning experience for the young James Jebbia, and in the end, he would spend a total of 6 years working in this retail position at Parachute. I want to pause and reflect on that briefly, because at first, 6 years sounds like a long time for a budding fashion prodigy to be working a retail gig, but I think there's an important lesson to be learned here. When James first arrived in New York City, he knew that he wanted to work in fashion, but he didn't know exactly where he fit in. And so, like many people, he took the first job that he could get just so that he could be around it. He knew from the beginning that this was a temporary gig, but he still made the most of it. He found a mentor, he learned everything he could along the way, he took mental notes on the minute details that most other people ignored, and then, when he was finally ready to branch out, which we'll talk about in just a second, he had the skill and knowledge to do so successfully. He didn't need some prestigious internship. He didn't need a formal education in business or fashion. He was just incredibly observant over a long period of time. I'm sure many of you listening to this right now might find yourselves in a similar position, working in a role that's adjacent to what you want to do, or maybe even in an entirely different field. So the lesson from James here is to extract knowledge from anything and everything you do, whatever that is, and that way, when you find out what you do want to do in the fashion industry, you'll be ready for it. And by this point in the story, that's where James found himself. After 6 years of working at Parachute, he decided that he was ready to launch his own business. His first foray into entrepreneurship was about as small scale as it gets, opening up what was basically a street stand on Broadway and West 4th where he tried selling backpacks. It's not clear how successful this endeavor was, but we know that he stopped in 1989 to make way for an even bigger and better endeavor. With the help of his friend Eddie Cruz, who had also worked at Parachute, as well as his friend at the time, Marianne Fusco, James opened Union, a streetwear shop located at 172 Spring Street in Soho. Now, I may have made the shift from working at a store to opening his own store sound way too easy, but let me put things into perspective. This was a 300 square foot storefront. That's about the size of an average one-bed hotel room. And just to get his foot in the door, he had to spend what little money he'd been able to save from working at Parachute. If this didn't pan out, I'm honestly not sure what his plan B was. Making this bet even riskier was his plan to have Union carry a mix of London-based brands that had not made their way to the States. The idea was that this would help differentiate Union, but at the same time, he was running the risk that these brands wouldn't be well received by the New York crowd. But shortly after opening the store, those fears all but dissipated. In short order, Union became a Soho staple, and its enigmatic frontman logo, as it's called, quickly became an icon of the neighborhood. A fun fact about this logo is that for many years, they intentionally chose not to reveal what the logo was or what it meant. It was a guy jumping in the air, and that's about all that anyone knew. But just a few years ago, Union, now under new ownership, confirmed that the logo was directly inspired by a still frame of actor Sidney Poitier in the 1961 film A Raisin in the Sun. Why they chose this image and why they added a halo to it are still not entirely clear, but what is clear is that people loved it. In fact, they loved it so much that they wanted to wear it. You see, in addition to selling other brands in the store, James began selling pieces with this logo on it, and this helped spread Union's popularity even further. To my knowledge, this is one of the earliest examples of the now ubiquitous streetwear model where you open a store, sell pieces that people already like, and then begin selling your own pieces alongside them to help elevate it in the eyes of the consumer. This may not have been James's intention, but it worked like a charm. And it's the exact same formula that Nigo followed nearly 4 years later when he began selling Bape in his Japanese boutique Nowhere. Now, like I said earlier, one of the original ideas behind Union was to bring a touch of London to New York's streetwear scene. But it was actually a California-based brand that changed everything. You see, across the country, a young surfer named Sean Stussy found himself in a peculiar position. He had decided to launch his own surfboard business, and in 1982, he began traveling around to different trade shows trying to sell some of his surfboards. Not thinking much of it, he decided to bring along some t-shirts to help promote his new company. Well, after going to trade show after trade show, he realized that he had only sold 24 surfboards. But somehow, he had sold nearly 1,000 shirts. Unwittingly, he had mastered the surf aesthetic, and from there, the path forward was obvious. In 1984, Stussy officially rebranded itself as a clothing company. And rather than going to trade show after trade show to sell surfboards, Sean's new mission was to take over the streetwear industry. That, of course, is where James Jebbia comes in. Sean needed someone with connections in the New York streetwear scene to help launch Stussy on the East Coast, and Union was the perfect place for him to do it. Seemingly overnight, Union had quietly turned James into one of Soho's most important tastemakers. If your brand ended up on the shelf of his store, it had a fair shot at being seen by just about everyone in the local streetwear scene. So, by all accounts, Stussy and Union seemed like a match made in heaven. But there was one problem. James had heard about Stussy and wanted to work with them, but Sean Stussy had not heard about Union. In fact, when James first reached out to Stussy about stocking their clothing in his store, he was told flat out that they weren't accepting any new accounts, and that was the end of the discussion. You see, Sean wanted to expand Stussy's footprint on the East Coast, but like nearly all great brand owners, he cared very deeply about managing the brand's image. That meant not just shipping his t-shirts to any store that called up and said that they wanted some. If he or someone whose opinion he trusted hadn't experienced it for themselves, it simply wasn't an option. So, for the time being, it seemed like Stussy and Union weren't meant to be. But then, Paul Middleman entered into the equation. Paul Middleman was a figurehead in the early days of the New York streetwear movement, and he happened to have been friends with both James Jebbia and Sean Stussy. When James learned that Paul would be having lunch with Sean Stussy the next time that he was in town, he asked him to pitch Union to Sean, and Paul agreed to give it a try. After their lunch, Paul kept his word and brought Sean over to Union, and Sean liked what he saw. Union had the authentic New York neighborhood vibe that he had been looking for this entire time, and right then and there he agreed to begin selling Stussy at Union. And it didn't take long for him to realize that this had been the right decision. Almost immediately, Stussy became Union's best-selling brand. Pieces were flying off the shelves, and they literally could not restock them fast enough to keep up with the demand. And after all, that was part of Stussy's marketing strategy. Keeping supply lower than demand created even more demand. This is a fairly simple concept in the field of behavioral economics, but its application to fashion, specifically streetwear, was still novel at the time. And as the owner of Union, James Jebbia was watching it unfold firsthand. He may not have known it then, but as we'll be talking about later, he would go on to use this exact supply and demand model more effectively than perhaps anyone else in the history of fashion. So it's interesting to think that this is when those ideas of his first began to form. But going back to the story. As I said before, James had wanted to work with Stussy from pretty early on, but he never could have imagined where working with Stussy would lead him. You see, Sean quickly learned that James was exactly the guy he'd been looking for. He understood streetwear culture, but more importantly, he understood New York streetwear culture. Union wasn't just a streetwear shop, it was a meeting place for the local streetwear community, and that's what set it apart. And because Stussy was selling so well at Union, Sean realized that the next logical step was to open a Stussy store of his own in Soho. And for all of the reasons that we just talked about, he wanted James's help to make it happen. So they got to work, and in 1991, Sean and James officially opened the doors to Stussy's New York store on Prince Street, just a few blocks over from Union. One thing I want to be clear about here is that Sean was still the owner and director of Stussy, and James's role had more to do with the opening and operating of the store itself, but this was still a very close partnership. So close, in fact, that James stepped away from his responsibilities at Union to focus on Stussy. Remember that Union had been a joint venture, so James had people he could rely on to keep things up and running there. But in the meantime, he really wanted to focus on the Stussy opening. So that's what he did, and he did it very well. Just like Union, Stussy quickly became a staple in Soho, and this had a profound impact on the brand's identity. In fact, Sean later went on to say that despite the New York location only making up 5% of their sales, it made up 100% of their brand image. And James Jebbia played a central part in making that happen. One reason that I find this to be so significant is that it proved that Union was not a fluke. Don't get me wrong, no one ever really thought that it was, but my point here is simply that in a matter of 2 years or so, James has successfully launched 2 new storefronts in one of New York City's most competitive environments. He clearly had the formula down pat, and had the ability to put that formula into action whenever and wherever he needed to. And good thing he did. Because as it turns out, he would need to do it once again, far sooner than he ever expected. It was around 1994 when Sean Stussy first began flirting with the idea of retirement. He had been running the brand for more than a decade at that point, and you have to remember that he had never even really expected to create the next big streetwear brand. He was a surfboarder who liked making surfboards, and his company's t-shirt line had unexpectedly taken on a life of its own. So maybe it's not all that surprising that he got to a point where he was ready to walk away from it. It would be another 2 years before he sold his remaining stake in the company to his longtime business partner Frank Sinatra Jr., who, I should mention, bears no relation to the Frank Sinatra. But either way, word about Sean's pending retirement got back to James, and it made him think. Like I said before, James and Sean's collaboration was a true partnership, and the more he thought about it, the harder it was for James to see himself sticking around with Stussy if Sean was no longer in the picture. And in hindsight, it's easy for us to say that Stussy would be just fine in the long run, but I'm sure that James was also wondering how the brand would survive without Sean at the helm. At the very least, it would be a drastic change. Union had been running smoothly for a few years at that point, and while James was still involved, going back there full-time never really crossed his mind. And with this news about Sean's pending retirement, James got to thinking about what his next venture might look like. And in a way, the answer was obvious. As you know, there is a huge overlap between the worlds of streetwear and skateboarding. This is something that James had noticed at both Union and Stussy. Many of the customers coming into these stores were skateboarders, and they would literally walk in with their skateboards on them, because when they weren't in the stores shopping, they were skating around the streets of Soho. And this became a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, because neither Union nor Stussy were conventional skate brands, but so many skaters had become fans of them that they became skate brands. This is exactly what Sean was alluding to when he said that the New York store accounted for 100% of the brand's image. He was talking about the New York kids who cemented Stussy's status as a skate brand. So, what does all of this have to do with James Jebbia? Well, as we've already discussed, one of James's strongest talents is that he is incredibly observant. And having spent so much time in and around Soho streetwear/skate culture, he realized that the one thing that Soho was missing was a proper skate shop. These kids were turning Union and Stussy into unofficial skate shops because they didn't have one. So in other words, James's idea for his next store had almost nothing to do with streetwear. His main focus was selling what he referred to as hard goods, like decks, grip tape, trucks, wheels, all the stuff that skaters actually needed. So, taking the $12,000 that he had saved up over the course of the previous few years, he rented yet another storefront in Soho, this one on Lafayette Street. When it came time for him to name this new store, he chose the name Supreme. Why Supreme, you might be wondering? Well, as it turns out, there's no real reason, other than the fact that James thought it sounded cool. And honestly, it makes sense that he didn't overthink things too much, because remember, his focus was not on selling Supreme branded products. He was primarily interested in selling skate gear made by other companies, so he just needed a cool name to put on the door. In fact, to drive home the point about how little thought was put into the name, James later reflected on the choice, saying that it actually became a significant problem for them because they couldn't trademark the name Supreme. It was such a generic, commonly used word that they were allowed to use it, but they weren't allowed to own it. And as we'll see later on in the story, this would actually play a part in Supreme becoming one of the most frequently counterfeited brands in all of fashion. Now, in addition to the name Supreme, the store needed a logo as well. As the story goes, James was unsure what logo he wanted to represent his newly founded skate shop. All he knew was that, much like the name Supreme, he wanted the logo to be bold and memorable. So one day, he was flipping through a graphic design book looking for inspiration, and he stumbled across the work of contemporary artist Barbara Kruger. Born and raised in New Jersey, Kruger crossed the river in 1965 to begin studying at Parsons School of Design in New York City. For anyone wanting a formal education in design, Parsons is one of the best possible places you can go. But after just one semester, Kruger decided that she didn't want a formal education in design. So she dropped out, and shortly thereafter, she began working as a graphic designer for Condé Nast. In case you're not familiar, Condé Nast is the parent company of Vogue. Kruger's work was primarily for their Mademoiselle magazine, but this was still a huge deal. And keep in mind that she was still just in her early 20s. Well, despite quickly moving up the ranks at Mademoiselle, Kruger decided after a few years that she was ready to pursue a career as an independent artist. I won't go into every detail of her career here, but it's important to know that in the subsequent decades, she would become one of the most impactful contemporary artists of her generation. She was known for using bold words and contrasting colors to deliver social commentary. Funny enough, and a bit of cosmic irony, one of her most iconic works of art was her 1987 piece, I Shop, Therefore I Am. Playing off of the famous Descartes quote, I think therefore I am, this piece openly criticized consumerism in America by essentially throwing a jab at people who conflate their identities with what they buy and own. While we obviously don't know this for certain, part of me likes to think that James Jebbia stumbled across this exact piece while flipping through that graphic design book and said to himself, let's use this to sell some t-shirts. Either way, Kruger's work would evidently serve as the inspiration for Supreme's logo, better known as the Supreme Box logo. I should clarify that to my knowledge, Supreme as a company has never publicly admitted to using her work as inspiration, so this is technically just speculation, but in the public forum this is widely accepted as fact. Despite that, however, Kruger has never made any attempts to sue Supreme. The obvious question here is why, and in my mind there are two reasons. On one hand, you have to remember that Barbara Kruger is a rebellious artist who has had a wildly successful career in her own right, and she doesn't exactly strike me as the type to spend her time or money waging what would inevitably be a major legal battle. On the other hand, and perhaps more importantly, it's important to note that she herself does not own the rights to the fonts used in her work, at least not the one we're talking about here. And to be specific, the one we're talking about is Futura Oblique. You see, Futura is a family of fonts, technically a typeface owned by Adobe, and pretty much anyone can use it. But before you do that, maybe you should read this book by Douglas Thomas called Never Use Futura. Despite the title, Thomas is not actually warning readers against using Futura, he's more so just poking fun at the fact that the font is so widely used. On the cover, he even lists some of the famous brands and individuals that have used Futura in the past, including Vogue, Louis Vuitton, and of course, Barbara Kruger. So it really is, like I said, pretty much anyone can use it. Major brands, famous artists, and even you and I. In fact, if we go onto the Adobe website and enter Supreme as the sample text, you can see that what we get is essentially the Supreme logo. That easy. Now, does this mean that you can pay for the license and start using the Supreme logo at free will? Absolutely not, because they've taken the font and made it uniquely identifiable, thereby allowing it to be trademarked. And trust me, they protect this trademark aggressively. In 2013, Supreme sued the brand Married to the Mob for $10 million for using a modified version of the Supreme logo. Supreme has been involved in several lawsuits over the years, but this one was special because it prompted Barbara Kruger's first and only public comment on Supreme. When Complex magazine asked her to comment, she issued a statement saying, "What a ridiculous, insert expletive, of totally uncool jokers. I make my work about this kind of sadly foolish farce. I'm waiting for all of them to sue me for copyright infringement." To translate this, she's basically calling out the irony of Supreme suing others for copying a design that they copied from her. And look, at the end of the day, this debate will never end. Did Supreme copy Kruger's design, or did they take inspiration from it? At a certain point, this becomes more of a philosophical question than a legal one, and that's probably why this debate has mostly taken place online instead of in the courtroom. But anyways, that is how Supreme's name and logo came into fruition. In the moment, these choices may have seemed inconsequential to James, but to be fair, he never could have predicted that in a matter of years, that name and that logo would be known all around the world. For the time being, he was just focused on getting this new storefront on Lafayette Street open for business. By James Jebbia's own admission, Supreme got off to a slow start. It was doing well enough to pay the bills, but it didn't yet have the cult following that Stussy or Union had, and part of that may have been the learning curve. You see, one thing that we need to remind ourselves here is that James's entire connection to the skate community was through clothing. He himself was not a skater. Through his time at Union and Stussy, he had formed strong connections in the local skate community, and over time they did accept him as one of their own. But the fact of the matter is that James was never the guy hanging out at the skate park after work trying to improve his kickflip. That's why he intentionally hired his friends from the skate community to work at the shop. On one hand, he was putting into practice the lesson he had learned from Morgan Allard back at Parachute, which is that the people you hire set the vibe of the store, so hire people that match the vibe that you want the store to have. But on a more practical level, he really just needed people who knew how to run a skate shop, and that meant hiring skaters. The first employee hired at Supreme was a young kid named Gio Estevez. Funnily enough, Gio was one of the few local skaters that James didn't know at that point. Probably because, as I said, he really was just a young kid. So young, in fact, that it was actually Gio's mom who told him that James was opening a skate shop and was looking for employees. Gio's mom and James happened to be friends, so they set up an interview and he got the job. From there on out, Gio became one of the consistent faces you would see when you walked into the store. In fact, in this photo, which to my knowledge is the earliest photo we have of the original Supreme store on Lafayette Street, it's Gio that you see sitting in the window. We'll be talking about some of the other early Supreme employees in just a bit, but other than James and Gio, it's not exactly clear who was actually there on opening day. And that's partly due to the fact that they didn't need too many people back then, because like I said before, business was a bit slow at first. As we just discussed, the first reason for this may have been the learning curve, but the other, more likely reason was the product selection. You see, when the Supreme store opened for business, their product offering was divided into two main categories. There were hard goods, which as we said includes stuff like decks and wheels for skateboards, and then there was clothing. But at this point in time, most of the clothing on their shelves was made by other skate brands like Zoo York and Shorty's. Keep in mind that these are true skate brands, not just streetwear brands, and the fact of the matter is that for a lot of these skate brands, clothing was sort of an afterthought. I'm not trying to throw any shade at them. Zoo York in particular did have some fantastic designs over the years, but their expertise was in hard goods, not in fashion. So pretty quickly, James discovered that skaters would come into the store, get whatever hardware they needed for their skateboards, and then skate around the corner to Union or Stussy to buy their clothing. Not only was this bad for business, but the diversion of foot traffic, or perhaps I should say wheel traffic, to other stores inhibited his grand vision of turning Supreme into the quintessential skater hangout spot. So from the outset, it looked like James had a serious problem on his hands. But thankfully, he had a saving grace. Well, technically, he had 4 of them. You see, when Supreme first opened for business, he took a page out of his playbook from Union and decided to sell 4 of his own Supreme branded t-shirts along all of the other skate gear. Those tees included the Shadow tee, also known as the Afro Skate tee, the Taxi Driver tee, which featured a print of Robert De Niro in the 1976 film Taxi Driver, the Basquiat tee, which featured Jean-Michel Basquiat's 1981 painting of a skull, and then last but certainly not least, the 4th and final tee simply featured the red box logo. Now, as we've already discussed, there were a few things that James Jebbia did in the early days of Supreme that may have seemed inconsequential to him at the time, but that would ultimately prove to be integral to the brand's identity, like the box logo, and even the name Supreme itself. And these 4 tees fall into that category as well. If I had to guess, I would say that he just picked whichever graphics he found to be the most visually interesting, but in hindsight, each of these tees have come to represent important pillars of the brand's identity. The Shadow tee is obvious. Despite moving further and further into the streetwear space, Supreme would, at its core, always be a skate shop. Even today, with nearly all of their revenue coming from clothing, they still manufacture decks, wheels, trucks, and whatever other gear skaters need to skate. Next is the taxi driver tee. And while there is a lot of symbolism in the Taxi Driver movie, much of it has to do with the main character Travis wrestling with and even contributing to the unpredictable chaos of New York City, something that many of Supreme's earliest fans would resonate with. It's also worth noting here that this is James's second time using a screen grab from a movie for one of his brands. Remember that he had used the image of Sidney Poitier when creating the logo for Union, so this taxi driver tee is further foreshadowing James's affinity for using pop culture references in his designs, something that would become a core part of Supreme's identity as a brand. Then there's the Basquiat tee. As many of you will know, Jean-Michel Basquiat was a born and raised New Yorker whose graffiti-style art turned the art industry on its head as he rose from abject poverty to superstardom before tragically passing away at the age of 27. On one level, this tee represents the fact that Supreme was for artists just as much as it was for skaters. But on an even deeper level, it may have given us a glimpse into how James Jebbia viewed Supreme's future. The line of thinking seemed to be, if Basquiat could turn graffiti into fine art, why couldn't he turn streetwear into high fashion? And then finally, we arrive at the most unassuming tee of all, the box logo tee. We will be talking about the box logo tee much more later on in the video, so I won't say too much about it now, but this is clearly indicative of Supreme's warm embrace of consumerism. Don't get me wrong, James Jebbia was by no means the first person to put his brand's logo on a shirt, I'm not saying that, but this was sort of his way of saying, yeah, we have t-shirts with cool designs, but our logo is cool too, and we want you to wear it. So I want to be very clear that I don't think anything I just mentioned was even remotely intentional. I really do believe that James was just picking designs that he thought were cool. But the things that he thought were cool back then clearly fed into Supreme's brand identity. And that's why, even today, you can go onto the Supreme website, pick any piece at random, and you'll probably be able to draw it back to one of the themes that we just talked about. I mean, think about it. These tees were released more than 30 years ago. But if you had never seen them before, and Supreme decided to include them in their next collection, they would fit right in alongside all of their new pieces. You would never know. And that's because Supreme as a brand is incredibly consistent. So the reason I'm spending so much time focusing on these 4 tees is because they really were important. Because even as Supreme would grow and eventually expand into new styles and product categories, these thematic foundations that we're talking about would largely remain the same. Now, one last fact that I want to give you about these tees is that when James was originally designing them, they didn't have the mini Supreme logo. It was specifically the shadow tee that he thought needed some extra flair because it was black and white, and adding the red and white box logo gave it the perfect amount of contrast. Throughout the years, this would become a common feature among Supreme tees, and more broadly, it may have contributed to the brand's tendency to plaster the box logo anywhere and everywhere they saw fit. But anyways, back to the story. These tees, as I said, were a saving grace for James, because even though his customers didn't like the other clothing in the store, they really liked these tees. Not only were the designs more interesting, but the quality was better too, because back then they were being made locally, not in a factory overseas, so it was an all-around better product. When they first released, James only made 60 of each tee, so it's not like they made him rich overnight, but the consistency with which customers picked his designs over the other ones in the store was revealing. And being the businessman that he was, James knew what he had to do next. Supreme the skate shop was going to become Supreme the streetwear brand. When James Jebbia made the decision to transition Supreme into a proper streetwear brand, the first thing he did was look for help. Up until this point, because he had primarily been selling clothing made by other brands, he had little to no design experience of his own. Sure, he had done a few pieces at Union, but those were mostly just the brand's logo on a t-shirt. Despite this lack of experience, as we saw with the first 4 Supreme tees, he had a uniquely strong sense of what people liked. So all he needed to do was work with graphic designers that could bring his visions to life. And that's where Brendan Babenzien comes into the picture. I'll save the full story on Brendan Babenzien for a future episode, because one day he would go on to found the brand Noah. But back then, he was just a kid trying to get his foot into the door of the fashion industry by designing for the Miami-based streetwear brand Mankind. Well, as it turns out, Mankind was one of the brands that James sold at Union. This meant that some of Brendan's designs were actually making their way into the hands of New York's streetwear community. But unfortunately, this success would be short-lived. As happens from time to time with fledgling streetwear brands, Mankind simply ran out of money and had to be discontinued. And that meant that Brendan was out of a job. Unsure of what to do next, he decided to move back home to Long Island, where he was originally from, and when Mankind's owner, Scott Nelson, heard about this, he had an idea. You see, Nelson had a good relationship with James, and on a whim he reached out and asked if he was in need of a good graphic designer. It just so happens that this was right at the time when James was planning on expanding Supreme's clothing line, and because he was already familiar with Mankind, he said yes. And just like that, Brendan Babenzien became Supreme's first official graphic designer. That was in 1996, and in 1997, just a few months later, Jeff Heath joined the team as well. It was actually Brendan who recruited Heath because they had previously worked together down in Miami. And that same year, Augie Gallen joined the design team. Augie had been working a retail position at Union when he heard that James was interested in bringing on some graphic designers for Supreme. Despite having no graphic design experience to speak of, he asked James for a shot, and James obliged. One interesting thing to note here is that the arrival of Heath and Augie in 1997 coincided with the opening of Supreme's first office space on 430 Greenwich Street in Tribeca. Now that he was hiring a team, James thought that they needed a space to work in, and it doubled as a design studio/storage facility as well. So that was the team, Brendan, Heath, and Augie, sitting in a room at their computers trying to come up with Supreme's next big t-shirt design. And this leads me to my next point. One question that people have always had about Supreme is to what extent is James Jebbia actually involved in the design process? Depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers, but it seems to me that James is, in the most literal sense possible, Supreme's creative director. What I mean by this is that he was never the one sitting at the computer drawing these designs from scratch. He wasn't even the one coming up with the ideas for some of these designs, but everything that went into production had to align with his creative vision for the brand. We talked about the thematic foundations of the brand's identity, and all of that comes directly from the mind of James Jebbia. I truly do believe that. And it was the job of his design team to work within those boundaries to come up with new designs. In an interview that he did a few years back with Complex magazine, George Heath gave an inside perspective on what the design process looked like back then. Because the internet then wasn't what it is today, he and the design team would go around New York City looking for magazines that they could source inspiration from. And oftentimes, inspiration meant seeing a graphic in a magazine and saying, let's put this on a t-shirt. So they would take these graphics, tweak them to their desire on the computer, and then run the final draft by James. One thing that Heath recalls quite vividly is that James could be tough to please. He wasn't trying to be difficult, he just had an incredibly strong creative vision, and if the tiniest detail didn't quite line up with that vision, he would send them back to the drawing board until they got it right. This was particularly true in the early days, because back then, the designers were still trying to get a sense of what James was looking for. But once they got that down, it appears that he actually gave them a fair amount of freedom. If they had an idea for a design, they could mock it up and show it to him. And if he liked it, they would make it. That simple. So while I maintain that James Jebbia was responsible for the creative direction of Supreme, these guys, Brendan, Heath, and Augie, were the ones putting the pen to paper. Needless to say, the formation of Supreme's first design team was an inflection point in the brand's history. This was the first real step towards achieving James's grand vision of turning Supreme into the next big streetwear brand. And it didn't stop there. Meanwhile, back at the store on Lafayette Street, James had hired Alex Corcoran to be the shop's general manager. Alex would have an influential role in how the store operated on a day-to-day basis, and much like Gio Estevez, he became one of the faces you'd consistently see in the Supreme store during the early years. In the grand scheme of things, hiring a general manager may not seem all that significant, but this was an early indication that James was preparing to take a step back from running the store so that he could focus more on the big picture items, like growing and marketing the brand. In fact, it was around this time that James introduced the first ever Supreme skate team. You see, despite the realization that Supreme was destined to be a streetwear brand instead of a skate shop, James's effort to create a hangout spot for the local skate community was actually starting to pan out. This was in part because the store was literally built for skaters to hang out in. Despite having very little space to work with, James decided to leave most of the floor space open so that customers could ride their skateboards in the store. The idea was basically to turn the Supreme store into an extension of New York City's sidewalks, and it had the desired effect of making the skaters feel like the store belonged to them. Now, because the floor space was left open, they displayed most of their t-shirts and skate decks on the wall. Even though this was mostly done out of necessity, it worked out perfectly because it made the Supreme store feel almost like an art gallery, where all of the pieces of clothing doubled as pieces of artwork. This may have helped to elevate the pieces in the eyes of customers, but more importantly, it made the store a more visually interesting place to hang out in. It also spoke to Supreme's New York roots, because Soho is famously home to many of the city's best art galleries, and by turning the store into a quasi-art gallery, Supreme was paying homage to the neighborhood while simultaneously leveraging its reputation to their own benefit. All in all, it was a brilliant strategy, one that not only inspired skaters to come into the Supreme store, but that also inspired them to feel like they belonged there. And that leads me back to the Supreme skate team. So let me start by answering the question, what is a skate team? Well, it's not really a team at all. They're not competing in the X Games or anything like that. It's just a group of skaters that are all sponsored by the same brand. You basically just find a skater that people pay attention to and deck them out in your newest collection. The concept of having a skate team was by no means new, plenty of other brands had them, and if I had to guess, I'd actually say that's why James felt the need to have one of his own. Despite his reputation for going against the grain, this is one of the few instances where James thought it made sense to march to the same beat as some of the other skate brands, because doing so would help solidify Supreme's transition into becoming a skate brand. You see, at the end of the day, skate teams are really just a marketing tool, but we have to remember that this was pre-social media, so it didn't look anything like a modern marketing campaign. It was way more grassroots than that. James was basically just giving free pieces to the skaters who hung out at the shop so that they would only wear Supreme. And while he obviously wasn't making money off of the pieces he gave to the skate team, the idea was that this would help spread awareness of Supreme at the local skate parks. To that end, one simple yet incredibly effective marketing tactic that he employed was giving the skate team an endless supply of Supreme box logo stickers. The idea was for them to carry these stickers with them as they skated around the city, and to put them pretty much anywhere and everywhere that they could. And when I say anywhere and everywhere, I mean anywhere and everywhere. You see, the brand had actually employed this guerrilla marketing tactic a few years prior to the formation of the skate team. It's not exactly clear who the idea came from, but someone at the brand saw these posters of Kate Moss for Calvin Klein all around the city, and thought it would be a good idea to plant Supreme stickers on as many of them as they could. At the time, I'm sure that they just thought that it was funny or edgy, but things got serious when they learned that they were being sued by Calvin Klein for defacing their advertisements. Fortunately, that lawsuit never led anywhere. The exact details of the case are not clear, but presumably Calvin Klein couldn't prove that Supreme was the one placing the stickers there in the first place, and even if they could have, there was no evidence that them doing so damaged the brand's identity in any discernible way. And despite this initial scare, I have to imagine that the positive outcome of this lawsuit gave Supreme even more confidence in their guerrilla marketing tactics, and encouraged them to keep using stickers anywhere and everywhere that they pleased. So before long, these stickers were popping up all over the place, and this really helped build brand recognition both inside and outside of the skate community. So like I said, this marketing tactic was incredibly effective. So effective that the brand still uses it today. If you've ever bought anything from Supreme, you've probably noticed that your purchase came with a handful of stickers, and that's not just them feeling generous. People love the stickers, so it is a win-win, but for Supreme, it's really just a low-cost way of getting you to market the brand for them. Now, I'm not saying that James Jebbia invented this marketing tactic, tons of brands do this, but few have done it as successfully as Supreme has. I mean, some of these free stickers are so coveted that they have actual resale value, and in a way, they've become an important part of the experience of buying Supreme products. Anyways, we now have a better understanding of what a skate team is and why James wanted one, but who was actually on the first Supreme skate team? Well, member number 1 was employee number 1, Gio Estevez. Then there was Ryan Hickley, Justin Pierce, and Peter Bishi, who had all previously skated for Zoo York's skate team. There was also Mike Hernandez, who had skated for a brand called Venture, the brothers Jones and Chris Keefe, as well as a few others. Throughout the years, new members would come and go, but this was the core group that got it all started. And again, I really want to emphasize that these guys were chosen to be on the Supreme skate team because they lived and breathed Supreme. They were the ones spending each and every day at the store, and they were the ones that James wanted representing his brand in the streets. So to tie a bow on all of this, 1996 and 1997 were momentous years for Supreme. During that time frame, James hired a team of graphic designers, opened an office space separate from the original store, hired a new general manager to oversee the retail operation, and then launched his largest marketing campaign to date with the introduction of the Supreme skate team. Things may have gotten off to a slow start, but Supreme was now firing on all cylinders, and people were beginning to take notice. By the end of 1997, everyone in James Jebbia's orbit knew that he was laser focused on pushing Supreme to new heights. But what no one, not even James, knew is that somewhere across the globe, there was someone who had even more ambitious plans for Supreme than he did. Someone he had never met before, or even heard of. That someone was Ken Omura, the brains behind a Japanese fashion distribution company called 1gram. Very little is known about Ken Omura. To my knowledge, this candid picture of him from a 2007 blog post is the only known picture of him on the internet. But without Ken, Supreme may have never become the internationally recognized brand that it is today. You see, while we don't know much about Ken, we do know that his finger was on the pulse of the American streetwear scene. I mean, to be fair, that was sort of his job. As a distributor, 1gram specialized in finding nascent international brands and scaling up their operations by expanding them into the Japanese retail market. In other words, they find brands that think Japanese consumers will like and bring them to Japan. Pretty simple. Now the big question here is, why did Ken Omura set his sights on Supreme? At first, it might seem a bit random, almost too good to be true. But the important piece of context to remember here is that in the late 90s, young Japanese consumers were obsessed with American streetwear. Brands like Stussy already had a foothold in the Japanese market, and Ken Omura was looking for the next Stussy. And given the success of his first few pieces, as well as James's track record of success with Stussy and Union, Supreme's potential was obvious to anyone who knew the industry, and Ken Omura was that guy. It's not exactly clear when Ken and James first came into contact, but it appears that Ken might have even had a hand in James's initial decision to transition Supreme from a skate shop into a full clothing brand. What we know for certain is that he had a hand in Supreme's international expansion. In fact, he's sort of the one that made it happen. With his guidance, 1gram struck a deal with Supreme to open 3 locations in Japan, all within a 6-month period. 1 in Tokyo, 1 in Osaka, and 1 in Fukuoka. Just a quick side note here, to commemorate the opening of the Tokyo store, Supreme released an exclusive version of the box logo tee. This is commonly referred to as the Daikanyama box logo because Daikanyama is the district in Tokyo where the store was located. This marked the beginning of the brand's now long-held tradition of releasing an exclusive box logo tee each time they open a new store. We'll be talking about some of these box logos later on, but for now, back to the story. So if history tells us anything, it's that rapid international expansion is a surefire way to kill the heart, soul, and authenticity of any company, let alone a brand like Supreme that prided itself on being a hometown original. But before you go calling anyone a sellout, let me explain why this decision actually made sense for Supreme at the time. James has always been deeply protective of Supreme's brand identity, and if he thought that this expansion would have in any way damaged that identity, he wouldn't have done it, plain and simple. But in the same way that Ken Omura had his finger on the pulse of the American streetwear scene, James Jebbia had his finger on the pulse of the Japanese streetwear scene, and by the time that Ken approached him about this partnership, he had already realized something crucial. Yes, the Japanese streetwear scene was largely centered around the American streetwear aesthetic, but they were such streetwear fanatics that the tide of influence was beginning to turn. Not only were they finding the next big brands before anyone else, but they even had a hand in determining which brands became the next big brands. That said, James realized that getting Supreme into the Japanese market could put them in a position to become the next big thing. And if he didn't get Supreme into the Japanese market when he did, who knows where it would be today. It's impossible to say, but that was exactly James's fear. So that explains the rapid expansion. But here is where things get interesting. Ken Omura knew the Japanese streetwear market better than just about anyone, and while he wanted to help get Supreme into the Japanese market, the goal was not just to bring Supreme to Japan. The goal was to bring demand for Supreme to Japan, and it worked. Japanese consumers quickly identified Supreme as a cool up-and-coming American streetwear brand. So demand grew, and pretty soon it became hard to get. And once they realized that it was hard to get, they wanted it even more. As a matter of fact, it was at these Japan locations that people first began lining up overnight for new Supreme drops. The problem became so severe that they had to implement a lottery system where people entered their names ahead of time just for a chance to shop in the store on release day. To put this into perspective, the New York location wouldn't put this type of lottery system in place until more than a decade later. And speaking of the New York location, just as Ken and James intended, the brand's exploding popularity in Japan was having a major impact back home. Because of the overwhelming demand that had developed in Japan, streetwear fanatics from as far as Tokyo would travel to the New York store, buy as many pieces as they could physically carry, and then bring those pieces back to Japan where they would sell them at a markup. It got to the point where James had to implement a rule limiting customers to just one of each item. The intention was to make it possible for a larger number of people to buy items, and to some extent that worked. But in a way, it also backfired. As you probably know, limiting supply drives demand. And while the total supply remained the same, this rule limited supplies on a per-person basis, which made each release feel that much more exclusive. It also made the lines longer, because now that more people had a shot at successfully purchasing items, more people were willing to stand in line. And they were willing to wait in line for longer amounts of time, too. Now, even though this was just a microcosm of what it would one day become, these were the origins of Supreme's resale market. Many people nowadays tend to think that this only took shape later on in the brand's history, but that is simply not the case. In a 2002 interview with the streetwear blog Rift Trooper, James Jebbia was asked for his thoughts on Supreme's resale market, to which he replied, "I don't like it very much simply because we try our best to make our clothing affordable for young people. After all, Supreme is a skate brand, and when I do see our things on eBay, the prices are normally at least double what they should be. Basically, I don't like people getting jacked for a t-shirt. I much prefer if someone buys something from us that they plan on wearing it and not selling." Again, that was back in 2002, just 6 years after the brand's founding. So while it's true that the hype was nowhere near what it would one day become, the foundations for the brand's success were certainly starting to take shape. This was thanks to the reinvested effort in their clothing, the guerrilla marketing, the culture at the store, the skate team, Kanamura bringing the brand to Japan. Everything was coming together all at once, and James's grand vision was finally coming to fruition. But rather than resting on his laurels, he decided it was time to turn things up a notch. Heading into the early 2000s, the only thing on James Jebbia's mind was taking over the streetwear industry. The design team that James Jebbia put together during the late 90s was exactly what the brand needed at that point in time. They played a critical role in defining the brand's aesthetic, and were directly responsible for many of its most iconic designs. But as he thought more and more about pushing Supreme beyond t-shirts and hoodies towards a full clothing line, he realized that he needed to bring in someone with the knowledge and expertise to actually execute on that. With that in mind, he began shopping around for someone with a more holistic understanding of the design process. And that led him to Luke Meyer. If the name Luke Meyer sounds familiar, it might be because Luke and his wife Lucy Meyer were co-creative directors of Jill Sander from 2017 until 2025. But back then, he was just a young FIT graduate who shared a love for skate culture. It's not clear how James and Luke met, likely through some association in the skate community, but either way, they hit it off. And in 2002, James appointed Luke as Supreme's first official design director. Even though he didn't have that much formal experience on his resume, the menswear degree from FIT, combined with his affinity for skating, appeared to have given James enough confidence to give him a shot. And I don't want to jump too far ahead in the story, but it's safe to say that this was the right decision, because Luke would remain in his role as design director from 2002 until 2009, which, in terms of development, were easily among some of the most pivotal years in the brand's history. Luke's appointment as design director was a clear indication of James's intentions for the future of the brand, and he resolved to do everything in his power to position Luke and the team for success. For starters, that same year, he upgraded Supreme's office space in a major way, moving them out of the small space on 430 Greenwich Street into a sprawling 3-floor space on 121 Wooster Street in Soho. Not only did this give the team a far better space to work in, but it also gave Supreme itself an added layer of legitimacy. It was his way of saying, this is not just a brand, this is a company, and we're going to act like it. And look, this is just me speculating based on what I understand about the situation, but it seems to me that James appointing a formally educated design director and moving the team into a giant new office space all at the same time was not a coincidence. I believe that he was actively trying to give Supreme that added layer of legitimacy, because it would be necessary for what he had planned next. You see, up until this point in its history, Supreme had, in a way, been operating on the fringes. The design of the Supreme box logo was seemingly taken from Barbara Kruger, the graphics they used in their designs were, in many cases, scanned out of magazines without permission. They had already been sued by Calvin Klein for their cheeky marketing campaign. More recently, they had received a cease and desist letter from Louis Vuitton for unauthorized use of their monogram logo. And again, the name Supreme wasn't even trademarked. When you list it all out like that, It's actually kind of insane to think that Supreme had operated this way for so long. And to be fair, a large part of their success was because they had operated this way. But James was beginning to realize that things didn't have to be this way. Not anymore, at least. The brand was now popular enough that if they wanted to work with someone else's intellectual property, they could just collaborate with them. Supreme had already done a handful of authorized collaborations, but they were mostly with other streetwear brands, like the box logo tee they did with Bape, or with local artists like RemLZ. There was nothing wrong with working with other streetwear brands or local artists. In fact, many of these collaborations were great, but James saw untapped potential. He envisioned a future where Supreme was collaborating with household names. But first, he needed those household names to take the brand seriously. One of the reasons that this might have been top of mind for him was that a potential collaboration with one of those household names had recently fallen out. In 2001, Nike was gearing up for the launch of its now iconic skate line Nike SB, and this of course included the now iconic Nike SB shoe. This was a concerted effort on Nike's behalf to break into the skate market, and in an effort to do so, they had reached out to James about doing a collaboration with Supreme. You can imagine how excited James was at the prospect of collaborating with a brand as big as Nike, so he did everything in his power to make it happen. But at the last minute, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, Nike backed out. Understandably upset by this, James then turned around and produced a line of t-shirts that reflected his feelings towards the shoe company. To be clear, these shirts never received an official release, he just made a limited batch for his own personal use, but nonetheless they are now an interesting piece of Nike Supreme history. And it was probably wise of James to never release these shirts, because as it turns out, the bridge between the two brands had not yet been burned. Somehow, someway, James made amends with his contacts at Nike SB. If I had to guess, I would say that Nike realized that working with Supreme was the best way to tap into the market of fashion-forward skateboarders, which is the exact demographic that Nike SB was built for in the first place. And at the same time, James was likely willing to let bygones be bygones because he realized what a collaboration with Nike could do for the brand's popularity. So, having buried the hatchet, Nike and Supreme got to work, and in September 2002, they officially unveiled the Supreme Nike SP Dunk Lows. To say that this shoe was well received by the general public would be a gross understatement. Many people point to this release as the inception of Supreme's hype culture, and there's a few reasons for that. In many ways, the Supreme Nike Dunks were a perfect storm. Nike had debuted the model just a few months earlier, and sneakerheads were already in a frenzy trying to collect each new colorway. Paired with the fact that this was by far the boldest colorway yet, sneakerheads who had never even heard of Supreme were just itching to get their hands on a pair. And speaking of the colorway, you may have noticed that these SBs made use of Nike's iconic cement print, also known as the elephant print, which had of course become famous thanks to its appearance on the Air Jordan 3. So not only did this shoe appeal to skaters, it appealed to basketball fans as well. And on top of that, the fact that this was a Supreme collaboration made the shoe a hot commodity in the streetwear community. So taking all of that into consideration, this collaboration was a true cultural phenomenon. And for Supreme, this was a turning point. James had set out to work with a household name, and he had done it. But still, he wasn't satisfied. On the contrary, working with Nike seemed to plant the idea in his head that if Supreme could work with a household name, maybe it could become one too. To get to that point, he realized that there was still a lot of work to be done, but feeling more inspired than ever, he and his team got to it. In 2004, about a year and a half after the release of the Nike collab, Supreme opened its second ever US location, this time on Fairfax Avenue in Los Angeles, California. As I said before, they commemorate each new store with an exclusive box logo, and this time it was a box logo featuring the Hebrew translation for Supreme, intended as a tribute to the Fairfax district's history as a central hub of LA's Jewish population. As far as the store itself, it was bigger and better than anything that Supreme had ever built before. We talked about how the New York location was designed to put skaters first. The floor was left open so that they could bring their skateboards inside. Well, with the LA store, they decided to take that to the next level by building a full-sized skate bowl in the middle of the floor. And because the location was nearly twice the size of the New York location, they could. It was a bold move, but that was the point. It reinforced the idea that Supreme was more than just a store. It was an experience. Even if you yourself had never touched a skateboard in your life, walking into the store and seeing guys hit tricks in the bowl while you were shopping made you buy into the brand's authenticity. And that was important because one of the primary motivations behind opening an LA location was to solidify Supreme's spot as the premier skate brand. You see, skate culture in the US was and is largely divided into two camps, East Coast and West Coast. Supreme had clearly staked its claim on the East Coast. If you went to a skate park in New York City, you could almost guarantee that you'd see someone wearing one of their pieces. But that wasn't the case in California, because you have to remember, Supreme didn't even have a website yet. If you wanted their pieces, you had to go to one of their stores. If you were really desperate and had the money, you could buy certain pieces that people were reselling on eBay, but the skaters actually doing that back then were few and far between. So if you went to a skate park in LA, seeing Supreme was actually somewhat rare. With the opening of the Fairfax store, James intended to change that. Before long, the Supreme store on Fairfax became a gathering place for LA's skate and streetwear communities, just as the store on Lafayette Street had become for those communities in New York. As a matter of fact, Supreme is often credited with bringing a number of other skate and streetwear brands to Fairfax. There had been a few shops here and there before they moved in, but once brands saw the foot traffic being brought to the area, they began to flock there. While things have quieted down a bit in recent years for reasons that we'll talk about, Fairfax was, for a time, one of the most important districts in all of fashion, nearly on par with places like Soho in New York or the Harajuku district in Tokyo. And again, it was largely because Supreme had set up shop there. To me, this was one of the early signs that Supreme was beginning to transcend fashion. James had set out to take over the streetwear industry, but he ended up with something much more than that. Right before his very eyes, Supreme was becoming its own movement. And while he wasn't sure where this new path would lead him, he knew that his only choice was to follow it. Supreme is a brand built on tradition. They design a new box logo tee whenever they open a new store. New collections are always released on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Every purchase comes with stickers, including at least one box logo sticker. These are just a few of the quirky things that the brand does that over the years, fans have come to love and expect. And in 2005, yet another tradition was added to this repertoire, one that fans would grow to love perhaps more than any other. It was in this year that Supreme released its first ever photo tee. The photo on the tee, which was taken by photographer Kenneth Capello, featured the legendary Wu-Tang Clan member Raekwon accompanied by his friend/bodyguard. As you can see, the friend is holding an Uzi, while Raekwon is holding a Tickle Me Elmo. Why is he holding a Tickle Me Elmo? I have no idea. But there's no denying that it presents an interesting juxtaposition with the Uzi and ultimately makes for a very intriguing visual. But don't let that distract you from the most important part of every photo tee, which is that the subjects in the photo, Raekwon and his friend, are both wearing Supreme box logo tees. The concept is admittedly a bit meta. It's a t-shirt about a t-shirt. But somehow it worked. It worked so well, in fact, that the following year they decided to do another photo tee. This time around, the tee featured two more New York rap legends, Joel Santana and Jim Jones from the rap group Dipset. And once again, it was Kenneth Capello behind the camera. Much like the Raekwon tee, the Dipset tee became an instant classic. And seeing the success of these tees, Supreme decided to keep doing them every season. And just like that, a tradition was born. While certain things do vary from tee to tee, such as the photographer they use for the shoe and the background of the photo, one thing always remains the same. Whoever's in the photo is wearing a box logo tee. At this point, there are nearly too many of these photo tees to count, but some of the most memorable have included Mike Tyson, shot by Kenneth Capello, Kermit the Frog, shot by Terry Richardson, Kate Moss, shot by Alistair McClellan, and Morrissey, once again shot by Terry Richardson. The Morrissey tee is particularly infamous because after doing the photo shoot, the English music star pleaded with Supreme not to use the photo they had selected, because A, he didn't like the way he looked in the photo, and B, because he had discovered that they had recently released a t-shirt featuring the White Castle logo, and as a staunch vegetarian, I guess he wanted nothing to do with a brand that had anything to do with a fast food chain. According to Supreme, they did offer to use a different photo, or even to abandon the release altogether if he simply returned the money that they had paid him, but it appears that no agreement was reached, because Supreme did of course end up releasing the tees just as they had originally planned to. And it would appear that Morrissey's last-minute change of heart backfired on him, because the controversy surrounding this photo tee has made it among the most popular in the entire series. People who didn't even know who Morrissey was were paying hundreds of dollars above the retail price to get their hands on it. Turns out that people really like wearing t-shirts of people that don't want to be on a t-shirt. So anyways, yes, that is how Supreme photo tees became one of the brand's most popular traditions. And before moving on, I want to note that this is the point in the story where we'll start to see Supreme's fanbase become more and more cult-like. They already had an extremely loyal fanbase, but it was with the introduction of traditions like the photo tee that made the fanbase feel more connected to the brand than ever before. And that's because traditions build consistency and anticipation, two of the most important things that a brand needs in order to build a dedicated following. Much in the same way that Supreme always releases on the same day at the same time, photo tees became something for fans to expect and look forward to each and every season. And although they expected it, the anticipation of which celebrity would be featured in the next one kept them interested. It became a year-round topic of conversation, and for many of the fans having these conversations, it was less about buying a new shirt than it was about collecting the latest piece of Supreme memorabilia. At that point, the concept of Supreme as memorabilia was really just starting to take hold. The only comparable thing at the time would have been the box logo tees that they released with each new store opening, which is no coincidence, were one of the brand's most beloved traditions. Now, if you take into account all of the changes that were going on, it's clear that Supreme was entering into a stage of growth. They were opening new stores, they were doing higher profile collaborations, and at least in some cases, they were no longer ripping their t-shirt graphics from magazines. They were setting up photo shoots with real photographers and real celebrities, which required a level of planning and coordination that no one at the brand had all that much experience with. And so that is why, in 2006, James decided to bring Angelo Bocche onto the team. This is another name that might sound familiar, because Bocche would later go on to found the popular clothing line Awake. But back then, he was still trying to establish himself in New York's streetwear scene. Other than growing up in Queens rather than West Sussex, Bocche's story was actually a lot like James Jebbia's. He realized early on in life that he wanted to pursue a career in the arts, but wasn't exactly sure where he fit in. Desperate for any opportunity that would get him closer to New York's then emerging streetwear scene, he began bouncing from retail job to retail job. And as it turns out, he had a real knack for it. Unlike many of his coworkers who were just there to clock in and clock out, Bocche became enamored with the ins and outs of running a shop. Things like merchandising, working with suppliers, marketing. He was learning on the job, but a lot of it came naturally to him. In the year 2000, after working at a few different shops throughout New York, Bocche eventually landed a job over at Stussy. Although James had already started Supreme at this point, he was still around the store enough that he and Bocche got to know each other fairly well. Bocche also got to know Brandon Babenzien, who, as we talked about earlier, was then Supreme's lead designer. So as you can see, the job at Stussy helped him get his foot into the door at Supreme, but any desire that he might have had at that point to join Supreme would have to wait. Because in 2003, after 3 years of proving himself at Stussy, he was offered a managerial position at Nom de Guerre. It's likely that many of you have never heard of Nom de Guerre because the brand was only around for a few years, but when it was first launched back in 2005, many people thought that it was going to be the next big thing in streetwear. In fact, if you've seen my video about the history of Aimé Leon Dore, you might remember that Nom de Guerre was one of the brands that heavily influenced Teddy Santis, the brand's founder. So, all that said, becoming the manager of Nom de Guerre's shop was a huge deal for Angelo Bocche, and while it was his work and talent that got him to that point, what happened next can only be attributed to fate. It just so happens that famous photographer Mary Pohl lived in the same building as Nom de Guerre's shop on the corner of Bleecker Street and Broadway. As Bocche recalls, she stopped by one day and was showing the guys in the shop the photo book she was planning to release. And to their surprise, it was chock full of photos from 80s New York, including some of the icons from that era such as Basquiat, Madonna, and Andy Warhol. Bocche immediately suggested that Mary Pohl host a release party for her book at the Nom de Guerre store, and she agreed. Then, on his own initiative, it was Bocche who put everything together, from printing out photos to setting up the space and of course marketing the event throughout the community. While many store managers get pigeonholed into focusing on operational logistics, this event was a rare opportunity for Bocche to flex his creative muscles, and he took full advantage. By the end of that night, it was clear to everyone, including Bocche himself, that the event had been a raging success. And while he walked away feeling empowered to host more events like this in the future, he didn't think that all much more about it. At least, that was the case until a few days later when he received an unexpected phone call from James Jebbia. James had caught wind of how successful the event had been, and he wanted Bocche to come work for Supreme. What Bocche's role would be wasn't yet clear to either of them. James just knew that whatever he was doing at Nom de Guerre, he wanted him to come do for Supreme. And look, it makes sense. With the Mary Pohl event, Bocche had helped Nom de Guerre transcend fashion. It elevated the brand's status in the local art community, and it did so while embracing 80s era New York. That right there is a succinct summary of everything that James Jebbia was trying to do with Supreme, and Bakke now stood out as someone that could help him achieve that. So, just like that, in the summer of 2006, Angelo Bakke joined Supreme. Like I said, it wasn't clear yet what his role would be, but pretty soon he found himself involved in just about everything. He was creating marketing campaigns, putting together lookbooks, developing brand strategy, and after the departure of Luke Meyer, he even became more heavily involved in the design process. One of the things that Bakke is largely credited with is overseeing Supreme's transition from a streetwear brand to a ready-to-wear brand. That meant introducing some more refined pieces like cardigans and sweaters to go alongside the brand's regular offering of t-shirts and hoodies. To be clear, Supreme was already moving in this direction when Bakke joined. That's one of the reasons that James had gone out and hired Luke Meyer, but Bakke helped take this to the next level. Over the years, as his role within Supreme evolved, and as he began to take on more and more responsibility, Bakke was given the title of Brand Director. Even with this title, it seems that his responsibilities were not all that well defined. But from what I can tell, James was still responsible for the creative direction of Supreme, while Bakke was primarily responsible for creative execution. He himself has said that he had the authority to be creative, but that James always had the final say, which is one of the reasons that he would eventually leave to start a brand of his own. But in the meantime, Bakke and Supreme were a perfect match. He was the right person to help usher the brand into the next stage of its evolution, and his timing could not have been better. Because unbeknownst to everyone, James was quietly planning to unveil something that would change the trajectory of Supreme forever. In September of 2006, to coincide with the release of their Fall/Winter 2006 collection, Supreme officially debuted its website, supremenewyork.com. And to say that this was a turning point in the brand's history would be an understatement. As I alluded to earlier when we were talking about the opening of the Supreme store in LA, one of the factors that was severely limiting the brand's growth was its limited geographical footprint. If you wanted to buy Supreme, you had to be in New York, LA, or Japan. The only places to buy online at that point were eBay and a handful of streetwear forums, and these transactions were typically far more expensive and way less reliable than buying directly from the source. So, when Supreme launched its website, it opened the door to streetwear fans around the world. You could now log on to the website from pretty much anywhere and buy the same pieces that people in New York and Tokyo were lining up on the sidewalk for. If you were lucky enough, that is, which is something we'll be coming back to in just a second. But first, let's get a glimpse into what the website actually looked like. Using the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, I was able to pull up an archived version of the website from 2006, and if you've ever been on Supreme's current website, you'll notice that practically nothing has changed. The layout is nearly identical, the font is identical, and the pages that you can navigate to are pretty much the same. And even though it's not all that different, it's still cool to think that 20 years ago, this is the exact page that Supreme fans were looking at when they booted up Internet Explorer and searched for supremenewyork.com. Even though the Supreme website did technically appear overnight, a significant amount of time and effort was spent preparing for its launch. You see, launching a web store in 2006 was nowhere near as easy as it is nowadays. Getting it up and running was one thing, but payment processing, inventory management, and cybersecurity were just a handful of the logistical pieces that they had to iron out before going live. And perhaps most importantly, James and team were entering uncharted territory in terms of supply chain management and distribution. By today's standards, online retail was still in its infancy back then, and even though Supreme had a good handle on the manufacturing process, they had virtually no experience fulfilling online orders and shipping products to customers, so this was something that they had to learn. And they had to learn as they went, because launching the Supreme website was less about putting the brand a step ahead than it was about not getting left behind. Make no mistake, Supreme was clearly outpacing most of its competitors by this point, but those same competitors were starting to launch websites of their own. Essentially, the streetwear industry's adoption of the online retail model became an intense race to win the business of the thousands and thousands of streetwear fans who didn't live in major cities. And this is something that James Jebbia was keenly aware of, because, as you'll recall, he was once that kid who had to travel 30 miles from his home in West Sussex just to get to the shops in London. There was no other way. But that was now changing, and he wanted to lead the charge. And not to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but in hindsight, it's safe to say that this was a success. Since its launch back in 2006, the Supreme website has been one of the single most successful online retail platforms in all of fashion, eventually growing to handle hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue each year. At least in part, this significant revenue growth can be attributed to the fact that Supreme began manufacturing more pieces to meet the online demand. That's one of the reasons that pieces released prior to 2006 are so much harder to find. They were only released in stores. But if you think that made Supreme any easier to purchase, you're wrong. Now that everyone had a chance to buy online, it felt like everyone was trying to buy online. Even people who lived in cities with Supreme stores. Anyone who was around back then likely has their own stories about the site lagging or even crashing while they were trying to check out. And that's because there were so many people on the site at once. I mentioned earlier that Supreme always releases new collections on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and because everyone knew this, everyone would log onto the website around the same time, impatiently wait for the clock to strike 11, and then rush to add whatever they could to their carts as fast as possible, hoping that whatever they had added didn't sell out before they finished checking out. If you've ever tried to buy Supreme online before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And while it is of course disappointing when you strike out, the adrenaline rush from just trying was borderline addictive for some people. In a very real sense, this became a ritual for Supreme fans. Even if they didn't particularly like anything from a new collection, they couldn't resist logging on at release time just to see what they could get in their cart. And if they could get it in their cart, oftentimes they'd buy it. There was even this phenomenon where after the most popular pieces in a collection had sold out, people would buy whatever was left on the website just to ease the pain of striking out. That's how I ended up with my Supreme Shrek tee. And no, that is not a joke. So for these reasons, even though the Supreme website was created to help meet demand, it actually ended up creating more demand. And aside from the obvious boost that this gave to the brand's popularity, this ended up having two unexpected consequences. The first of these consequences was the proliferation of bots. In layman's terms, bots were computer programs that people built to automate the checkout process on Supreme's website. The best ones were capable of checking out in just a few seconds, faster than most people could even add the piece that they wanted to their cart. This was a direct response to the high traffic on Supreme's website, and it made the problem 100 times worse. As if that wasn't bad enough, the anonymous nature of these bots allowed people to evade the limits that Supreme had set on how many pieces each individual could buy. So if someone successfully used a bot to buy a bunch of the latest photo tee, they could easily corner the market and set the resale price however high they wanted to. This contributed to what is one of the largest criticisms of Supreme, which is that their pieces tend to resell for astronomical prices. Over the years, Supreme has worked to combat bots to the best of their ability, but as time has gone on, these bots have only gotten harder to detect. So it's a difficult problem to solve, and it's incredibly frustrating for fans who just want a fair shot at buying the piece they want. In fact, this leads me to the second consequence of the Supreme website that I want to talk about, which is that it actually made the lines at the store longer. Like I said before, the launch of the Supreme website exposed the brand to a larger audience than ever before, but as some of these fans struggled week after week to successfully buy pieces online for the reasons that we just talked about, they realized that the only way to guarantee their purchase was to be among the first people in line at the store. Again, this option had always been available, and there were already people lining up at the stores well before the website launched, but it was in the years after the launch that we really began to see an uptick. Needless to say, the debut of Supreme's website was yet another turning point in the brand's history. I'd even go as far as saying that it's among the most pivotal that we've talked about thus far. Not only did it expose the brand to entirely new markets, but the influx of cash that came with it allowed James to reinvest in the brand more heavily than ever before. This set the stage for bigger and better collections, new stores, dream collaborations, and perhaps most importantly, it allowed Supreme to take more risks. As a brand, Supreme had never shied away from taking risks, but at the end of the day, they were running a business, so they were naturally less inclined to put time, effort, and money into something that wasn't going to sell. But now that they had a bit more money to play around with, paired with the fact that everything they released seemed to sell out instantaneously, they were willing to push the boundaries a bit further. Case in point, in 2006, they collaborated with Louisville Slugger to release a Supreme branded baseball bat. Supreme fans are not known to be particularly avid baseball fans, and the bat would obviously not be the first choice of anyone who actually played baseball. So who this bat was marketed towards, I'm not exactly sure. But they did it because they could, and because they wanted to. And lo and behold, it was a major success. This baseball bat was among the earliest examples of what would become yet another tradition for Supreme, which is that they tend to release unexpected and sometimes downright odd accessories with each new collection. Over the years, some of the most memorable have included Supreme branded nunchucks, a fire extinguisher, a crowbar, and of course, my personal favorite, a literal brick. For fans of the brand, these quickly became highly sought after collector's items, most often used for decoration rather than for their ostensible purpose, but still, this fed into the public perception that Supreme fans were willing to buy anything with a box logo on it. And to be fair, that was proving to be the case. This was yet another sign that Supreme had transcended fashion, and they were now embracing it. This was a sign of things to come. Over the course of the next few years, Supreme's growth strategy was simple: collab, collab, collab. In 2006 alone, they released a pair of Vans in collaboration with photographer Ari Markopoulos, a series of skate decks with the legendary artist Jeff Koons, a range of apparel with the rap group Public Enemy, a collection of boots with Timberland, and then more apparel with the Japanese streetwear brand Neighborhood. And while that may sound like a lot, it pales in comparison to 2007, when they did their first ever collaboration with The North Face, a series of skate decks with artist-photographer Richard Prince, sunglasses with Oakley, more Vans, a line of apparel with the Japanese label Double Taps, t-shirts with the artist Joe Cool, more skate decks, this time with Takashi Murakami, t-shirts with the illustrator Robert Crumb, a line of Nike Air Trainers, another collab with Neighborhood, and to top things off, even more Oakleys. Now, my intention is not to go over every single collab that Supreme has ever done, because some are certainly more significant than others. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that Supreme went from doing 5 collabs in 2006 to doing 11 collabs in 2007. Clearly, this was intentional. But why? Why were they doing so many collabs? Well, if the answer seems obvious, that's because it is. Collaborating was the best way for Supreme to branch into new markets. I mean, think about it. Among the collaborations I just listed, there were artists, photographers, rappers, outerwear brands, athletic wear brands, streetwear brands, the list goes on. These collaborations gave Supreme instant access to audience that they otherwise wouldn't have had, and in many cases, it also allowed them to jump to the top of the food chain in areas where they had little expertise. For instance, rather than taking the time to design, manufacture, and market a winter jacket of their own, they could just work with the North Face. North Face brought the reputation for high-quality outerwear, and Supreme brought the streetwear flair that made it so popular. And that's where I want to ensure that Supreme gets its credit. What made these collabs so cool is that no one had ever seen a North Face jacket like that before. No one had ever seen Timberlands like that before. So in the same way that these big-name brands were painting Supreme in a new light, Supreme was painting these big-name brands in a new light as well. And as well established as some of these brands were, many of them had never gotten the type of overwhelming response that they got when working with Supreme, and that's why so many of them kept coming back. At the time of writing, Supreme has collaborated with Timberland more than 20 times, with the North Face more than 40 times, and with Nike more than 50 times. And keep in mind that a number of these collaborations included multiple different pieces and colorways. Those numbers are staggering, and it points to the fact that Supreme's collaborations are mutually beneficial. Brands and artists want to collaborate with Supreme. Among the most memorable, aside from the ones I've already mentioned, have been Damien Hirst, Comme des Garçons, Stone Island, Tiffany & Co., and Lamborghini, just to name a few. And if it seems like I left out a few very important ones, you're right. But don't worry, we'll be coming back to those later in the story. Now obviously, Supreme did not invent collabs. They weren't even the first ones to do it in the streetwear space. But to my knowledge, they were the first ones to build a business model around it. And I would argue that to this day, no brand has used collabs more effectively. After going from 5 collabs in 2006 to 11 collabs in 2007, the numbers just kept going up and up. Each year, Supreme has found new and exciting partners to collaborate with. But one thing I want to be clear about here is that even with the number of collaborations going up each year, Supreme remained highly selective about who they worked with. One of the reasons for doing these collaborations in the first place was to curate a very specific brand image that they otherwise would not have been able to obtain. And for that very reason, doing collaborations with everyone that came knocking, even if they were a well-known brand or artist, would have been detrimental to the overall strategy. So, Supreme understood the importance of who they were associated with, and as it turns out, that didn't just apply to collaborations. After releasing his debut album in December of 2009, LA native Tyler Okonma, better known as Tyler the Creator, began amassing a cult following online. Carving out his niche in a subgenre of rap commonly known as horrorcore, his eerie production and controversial lyrics were strangely gravitational. What made Tyler even more intriguing is that the look did not match the sound. The songs were borderline disturbing at times, but the kid behind the mic was wearing a tie-dye t-shirt and Vans. But that wasn't all, because it just so happened that as an avid skateboarder, Tyler was also an avid fan of Supreme. His favorite item was evidently Supreme's 5-panel hat, also known as the camp cap. Although it was originally designed for military personnel, a lighter-weight, moisture-resistant version of this style of hat was later popularized by cyclists. The ones that Supreme made were not the type you'd see on the Tour de France, of course, as they put fashion over function when marketing their own version of the hat to skateboarders. They may not have been the first skate brand to release 5-panel hats, but nowadays they are widely credited with popularizing it in the skate community, and Tyler played a big part in that. As his following continued to grow, more and more people were paying attention to what he was wearing, and as he got a bit more money to buy what he'd always wanted to buy, he began wearing more and more Supreme. I mean seriously, if you look at photos from say 2009 to 2012, he's wearing Supreme in just about all of them. The same goes for the members of his rap collective, Odd Future. And unlike the photo tees where Supreme had paid celebrities to wear their clothes, Tyler and his crew were just wearing it because they loved it. Fans could feel that authenticity, and it had a way more powerful effect than any marketing campaign that Supreme could have devised on their own. And while they may not have devised it, by all appearances they did embrace it. In the opening track for his 2011 album Goblin, Tyler raps about getting free Supreme, which may have something to do with the fact that by this point, he was wearing Supreme in nearly all of his music videos, including the video for his smash hit song Yonkers. So in a way, he had become the unofficial poster child of Supreme. And in just a few short years, he became one of the most closely followed figures in hip-hop, fashion, and skateboarding. And he brought Supreme along for the ride. To be clear, Supreme was already wildly popular when Tyler started wearing it. Collections were already selling out, and people were already standing in line for hours to buy it. But it's hard to think of any one individual who has done more to boost the brand's popularity than he has. At the very least, we can say for certain that there are plenty of people who discovered the brand because of him. In recognition of that fact, he was even given his own photo tee as part of the Fall/Winter 2024 collection, which I have to imagine was the ultimate full circle moment for him, having been a fan of the brand since he was just 16 years old. So it's interesting. On one hand, James Jebbia and his team were strategically seeking growth through collaborations, but on the other hand, they were seeing organic growth as well, thanks to influential figures like Tyler spreading the brand to new audiences. And the synergy of these things happening at the same time had an exponential effect on its growth. No one had ever seen anything like it before. Supreme was already big, but it was somehow getting bigger. Too big to be ignored. James Jebbia and his team could now sense that the world was watching, and they were up to the challenge. Supreme's growth manifested in a few different ways, and one of those ways was the opening of new stores around the world. In 2011, they opened a store in London, and this was significant on a few different levels. First, I'm sure that this had to have been a major milestone for James. As we know, he grew up in England and spent his early years making the trek to London to check out the coolest new stores. Now, he owned one of those stores, and it was the coolest of them all. For this location, James brought the New York Art Gallery aesthetic to London, and fans were just as eager to step inside and look around as they were to buy the newest collection. Speaking of which, the other reason that this store opening was significant is because it marked the brand's entry into the European market. Prior to this point, European streetwear fans had to buy online or travel if they wanted to get their hands on Supreme. But that was no longer the case, and they jumped at the opportunity. Much in the same way that fans in New York, LA, and Japan were lining up for hours on end for new releases, fans from around Europe began traveling to London to do the same. And of course, to commemorate the opening of the London store, Supreme released this Union Jack-inspired tee. A year later, in 2012, they opened yet another store in Japan, this time in Shibuya, accompanied by the release of this box logo tee. And while unlike the London store, this was not a new market for Supreme, it was an indicator of how wildly popular the brand had become in Japan. Back when Kanamura helped James open 3 different Japan locations in the span of just 6 months, some people thought that this was overly ambitious, that they were overextending themselves. Since then, they had opened 2 more locations, including the Harajuku store in 2006 and the Nagoya store in 2008. But here they were, a few years later, realizing that this was still not enough. And the timing was perfect, because in 2012, that same year, Supreme released its first ever collaboration with Comme des Garçons, the Japanese label founded by the fashion icon Rei Kawakubo. Comme des Garçons was both a bit higher end and more avant-garde than many of the brands that Supreme had ever collaborated with up until that point. And while many fans focused on the backwards box logo and polka dots, some of those high-end and avant-garde elements did make their way into the collection. And that was intentional. This collaboration was meant to be Supreme's gentle introduction into the world of higher-end fashion. That's why, several years later in an interview with Vogue, James Jebbia reflected on this collaboration, saying that it opened a lot of doors and a lot of eyes. And he's right. As subtle of a shift as it may have been, many people began viewing Supreme in a different light after this collection. And to take it a step further, many Supreme fans began viewing themselves in a different light as well. For many of them, these were the first designer items that they had ever purchased. And even if it was still just a hoodie or a t-shirt, walking around in something designed by Rei Kawakubo gave them the confidence to say, I'm into fashion. And it's because Supreme made that accessible to them. So more significant than the collaboration itself is what this collaboration represented. It represented a shift in mindset, both for Supreme and for its fans. It was an early sign that Supreme was ready to break down the walls of high fashion, and that their fans were ready to storm in behind them. So clearly this was the beginning of a new era for Supreme, and with that, you could say that the previous era was coming to a close. And it just so happens that this shift was taking place around the same time as Supreme's 20th anniversary in 2014. To celebrate the anniversary, the brand released a 40-minute skate video called Cherry. As you can see from the official description of the video on Supreme's website, Cherry was directed by William Strobeck and features skaters Tyshawn Jones, Sajal Sessler, Sean Pablo, Knockout Smith, Kevin Bradley, Aiden Mackey, Paulo Diaz, Mark Gonzalez, Dylan Ryder, Alex Olson, and Jason Dill, the latest iteration of Supreme's skate team. Fans loved this video because at a turning point in the brand's history, it was Supreme's way of acknowledging that no matter what happened next, what got them there was being a skate brand. And things would change, drastically, which is why many fans nowadays divide Supreme's history into the pre-Cherry era and the post-Cherry era. The post-Cherry era started off with a bang. In March of 2014, just 2 weeks after announcing the release of Cherry, Supreme and Nike announced that they would be collaborating on a pair of foam posits. The two brands had of course been collaborating for several years by this point, but during that time, both streetwear culture and sneaker culture had exploded in popularity. And now the biggest streetwear brand and the biggest sneaker brand were coming together to collaborate on one of the most popular sneakers, the foam posit. When people talk about hype culture, there are few examples better than this. Sure, Supreme had dealt with hype before, even as far back as the 2002 Nike Dunk collab, but the pure hysteria that accompanied these new foam posits was unlike anything that anyone had ever witnessed. On April 2nd, the night before the release, fans began camping out on the sidewalk in front of the store on Lafayette Street. And when I say camping out, I mean that literally. Some people brought tents and chairs to make themselves comfortable for the night ahead. Others brought nothing, prepared to brave the elements until the doors opened the following morning. According to reports, there were as many as 300 people in line by 5 p.m. And as the hours ticked on, the line got longer, and longer, and longer. By 8 p.m., the number of people in line had at least doubled, and by that point, the NYPD had been called to help control the crowd. Despite placing barricades along the sidewalk to prevent the line from flowing out onto the street, the chaos and confusion only seemed to grow. As people at the back of the line began to realize that their hopes of purchasing the shoe were slim, they began pushing to the front, cutting the line and fighting their way to the store's front door. Fearing that a riot could break out at any moment, the NYPD made the decision to shut down the line, citing public safety concerns. And just like that, for the first time in its history, Supreme had to cancel a release. Not only did they move this release online, but they decided that for the foreseeable future, to prevent this from happening again, all Supreme Nike collabs would only be released online, at least for the US. That's why, in 2015, when Supreme did a landmark collaboration with Nike's Jordan brand, these shoes were not sold at the New York store or the LA store. This collab was arguably even more hyped than the Foamposite collab, thanks in part to the sheer excitement at seeing Michael Jordan in a Supreme tee, but because it was an online release, it didn't cause nearly as much chaos. Nevertheless, the damage had been done. Supreme releases now had a reputation for being insane, and rather than steering clear of the chaos, many fans embraced it. While not every release was as bad as the Foamposite release, the lines were still drawing a significant amount of attention week after week. And pretty soon, the fans standing in line found themselves joined by news channels and media outlets, all trying to understand this mystifying force called hype that was making kids sleep on the sidewalk for a t-shirt. In my opinion, the series that Emily Oberg hosted for Complex was the best at documenting what these Supreme lines were actually like. Bringing a camera and a microphone to the front lines of the action, Emily went through the line asking fans anything from "What are you looking to buy today?" to "How long have you been sleeping here?" The series became so popular that some of the recurring interviewees, like Rax Hogan, basically became celebrities in the Supreme community. It was one thing to hear about lines outside of the Supreme store, but these videos gave people like me, who were nowhere near a store, a glimpse into Supreme's culture, one that otherwise we never would have seen. This new era of Supreme, the post-Cherry era as we called it, was quite literally being broadcast to the world, and more people than ever were paying attention. And just when we were beginning to think that the hype around Supreme could not get any crazier, it turns out that they were planning their biggest announcement yet. An announcement that would change the course of fashion forever. By early 2017, Supreme was one of the most counterfeited brands in the world. Between the popularity of Supreme, the exorbitant resale prices, and the ease of replicating some of their simpler designs like the box logo tees, the brand became a prime target for counterfeiters around the world. The most infamous example was the case involving international brand firm, IBF for short, a European company that not only made knockoff Supreme products, but sold them in knockoff Supreme stores under the name Supreme Italia. This was so obvious that you would think it would be easy for the real Supreme to have them shut down. But due to international trademark law, this proved to be much harder than they'd expected. Basically, IBF was taking advantage of Supreme's lack of trademark filings throughout Europe. In Italy, Supreme had not yet trademarked its famous red box logo, so IBF came in and said, "Let's use it." This practice gave rise to the term legal fakes, which basically refers to counterfeit products that are produced using legal loopholes like the one I just described. Fortunately, Supreme was successful in its lawsuit against Supreme Italia, but to this day, the brand is still waging battle after battle against counterfeiters throughout Europe and Asia. Some of these counterfeit pieces are so bad that no Supreme fan would ever mistake them for the real thing, but others are much more convincing. So, when rumors began circulating about a collaboration between Supreme and Louis Vuitton, most people thought that it was fake. And to be fair, that was the most logical conclusion. Not only was it unheard of for one of the major fashion houses to collaborate with a streetwear brand, but as far as we knew, there was bad blood between these two. As you'll recall, Louis Vuitton had once sent Supreme a cease and desist letter for using their monogram logo. That alone was enough for most people to write this off. But then, something interesting happened. Something that they couldn't ignore. In June of 2016, James Jebbia was seen in the audience at Louis Vuitton's Spring-Summer 2017 fashion show in Paris. One thing I've alluded to already that I really want to emphasize here is that James is known for being reclusive. He doesn't do many interviews, he doesn't make many public appearances, and he certainly doesn't show up at European fashion shows just because. So nobody knew why he was there, but he was there for something. And suddenly, those rumors about a collaboration didn't seem so outlandish after all. For the next few months, things were quiet. There were a few blurry photos being sent around of what were supposedly pieces from the collaboration, but there was nothing definitive. Until, on January 19th, 2017, Louis Vuitton director Kim Jones debuted his Fall-Winter 2017 menswear collection, and to everyone's surprise, the models stepped out onto the runway wearing Supreme. There had been no announcement, no press release, no Instagram post. This was the world's first time seeing the collaboration, and it set the internet ablaze. In my opinion, the best part about this collaboration is that Kim Jones leaned into what the fans wanted. He wasn't afraid to use too much red, He wasn't afraid to overdo the monogram, and he wasn't afraid to put the Supreme logo wherever he could find a place for it. Other directors likely would have dialed some of these elements back a bit, likely in an attempt to make Supreme's aesthetic more quote-unquote tasteful, but he understood that this collection was more about Supreme than it was about Louis Vuitton, and so he wanted to embrace the brand's ethos of being loud, being bold, and being unapologetic while doing it. One of the reasons that Kim understood this so well was because he himself was a major streetwear fan. In fact, while attending school in London, Jones worked part-time for a company called Gimme 5, which specialized in distributing streetwear brands throughout the UK. It was through this job that Jones was introduced to brands like Stussy, Undercover, and of course, Supreme. After graduating from Central St. Martin's in 2002, he found himself in a few different roles, mostly in the high-end fashion space, but he never lost sight of his love for streetwear. At one point along the way, he was even brought on as a consultant for Kanye West's unreleased streetwear line Pastel. So, in 2011, when he became the menswear director for Louis Vuitton, streetwear was already in the back of his mind. And as he settled into his role, you could see more and more of that streetwear background manifesting in his collections, ultimately culminating in the Louis Vuitton Supreme collab. One of the reasons that Jones deserves so much credit for this collab is that he really was sticking his neck out for Supreme. He knew that streetwear fans would love it, but there was a legitimate fear that everyone else in the fashion industry would scoff at it. In a later interview with the Wall Street Journal, Jones even said the Supreme Vuitton collaboration could have completely backfired on me. But it didn't. And he's right, it didn't. Sure, some people had their criticisms, but for the most part, Kim was praised for calling attention to something that so many others in his position had been trying to ignore. The lines between streetwear and high fashion were beginning to blur. In terms of price, demand, and sometimes even quality, some streetwear brands, led by Supreme, were beginning to close the gap on some of these age-old fashion houses. This was Jones's way of declaring that times were changing and that Louis Vuitton was willing to adapt instead of getting left behind. And if you ask me, this collaboration helped pave the way for guys like Virgil Abloh and Pharrell Williams to one day lead Louis Vuitton. It also paved the way for more collaborations between streetwear brands and fashion houses. In the years following this collaboration, Supreme would work with the likes of Jean Paul Gaultier, Emilio Pucci, Burberry, Margiela, and Girbaud. Back in 2016, if you had told a streetwear fan that Supreme would collaborate with any one of the names I just listed, they probably wouldn't have believed it. But after the Louis Vuitton collab, anything seemed possible. This was a new chapter for Supreme, but it was also a new chapter for the fashion industry. As if we needed any more confirmation of that fact, in 2018, James Jebbia was awarded the CFDA's Menswear Designer of the Year award. The other nominees included Raf Simons, Virgil Abloh, Tom Brown, and Tom Ford. It goes without saying that this is good company to be in, and James himself seemed a bit surprised to be included among them. During his acceptance speech, he said, "I've never considered Supreme to be a fashion company or myself a designer, but I appreciate your recognition for all we do." And to me, this simple statement speaks volumes. It tells me that there was a growing divide between how James saw Supreme and how the world saw Supreme. It seems that even though he wanted the brand to grow, he never fully let go of that image in his head of a tiny skate shop in the corner of Soho where skaters came to hang out and check out his latest t-shirts. But now Supreme was being treated as a fashion house, and James was being treated as its head designer. In his mind, neither of those things were true. But in reality, they were true. Supreme was growing into something that even he didn't recognize. In February of 2017, just a few months before the release of the Louis Vuitton collaboration, brand director Angelo Bacche decided to walk away from Supreme. Publicly, he has said that he made this decision because he wanted to focus on building his own clothing line called Awake. And to be fair, that's exactly what he did. But part of me can't help but wonder if some of the changes that were beginning to take shape behind the scenes may have played a part. You see, a few months later, in August of 2017, Supreme announced that they would be implementing a lottery system at the New York location, similar to the one that they had implemented several years earlier in Japan. Now, if you wanted to get into the store on release day, you had to sign up online and hope to get selected. This meant that those crowds of kids from the Complex videos were no longer lining up on the sidewalk overnight. They were at home, waiting for an email. And while I get that this was done out of necessity, there's no denying that it took away part of what made Supreme Supreme. It truly was the end of an era. But this was only the beginning. 2 months after implementing the lottery system, Supreme made an even bigger announcement. They were selling 50% of the company to the Carlyle Group, an American private equity firm with nearly $500 billion in assets under management. Carlyle had reportedly paid $500 million for this 50% stake, meaning that Supreme had officially been valued at $1 billion. Fans immediately grew concerned that this was the end of Supreme as they knew it, and those concerns were justified. Anytime that a large private equity firm makes a major investment like this, the intention is obviously for that investment to grow. Some of those private equity firms say, hey, we like your business model, take this money and go get even better at what you're already doing. But other private equity firms say, hey, we own half of your company now, you're going to do what we tell you to do. This is called being an activist investor, and that's exactly what Supreme fans were afraid of. They didn't want some giant company ruining the heart and soul of the brand just to squeeze every last dollar out of their investment. And thankfully, that didn't happen. Rather than ramping up production to sell more pieces or lowering production quality to improve profit margins, their strategy was largely centered on expanding Supreme's footprint by opening more stores. Case in point, in 2018, the year after the acquisition, Supreme opened a second New York location, this time on Grand Street in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. With the opening came the release of this camo box logo. And 1 year later, in 2019, they opened their second location in California, this time on Market Street in San Francisco. To celebrate this opening, they released the simple two-sided box logo tee. These new locations were welcomed additions to the growing roster of Supreme stores, because at the end of the day, they were simply bringing the Supreme experience to fans in new places. Nothing too controversial about that. But not every new store was so well received. One store in particular pushed many fans past their tipping points. In February of 2019, Supreme posted a statement on their Instagram saying that the original store on Lafayette Street in New York would temporarily close for renovations, and in the meantime, they'd be relocating to 190 Bowery Street. At first, nobody thought much of it. This was only temporary. But in September of that year, pictures began circulating online of a for lease sign in front of the Lafayette store, confirming that the move was not temporary after all. The original Supreme store was now closed for good. It's not clear what changed during those few months. The store on Bowery Street was significantly larger, and they put a lot of time, money, and effort into renovating it. So it's likely that they just reached a point where, logistically, it made more sense to stay. And while it's hard to fault them for that, this decision raised the same question that fans had recently started asking about the brand itself. Do they care more about growing the brand than they do about honoring its history? It's a difficult question, and to be fair, growing a brand and honoring its history are not mutually exclusive things. Nevertheless, this was the gut reaction many people had when they realized that they would never step foot in the Lafayette Street store again. I actually think that if Supreme had made this move before selling 50% of the company, the general public might have been more receptive. But because they did it after the fact, it seemed to reinforce the idea that the old Supreme was gone for good. And to make matters worse, it was just 1 year later, in November of 2020, that we learned that Supreme was being bought out by VF Corporation for $2.1 billion. VF Corporation is the same conglomerate that owns Vans, The North Face, and Timberland. These are all brands that Supreme had formed close partnerships with over the years, so on paper, the brands seemed to fit well into the company's portfolio. But the heart-wrenching part about this acquisition is that VF Corporation wasn't just acquiring the Carlyle Group's stake. They were acquiring James's as well. This meant that as of November 2020, James Jebbia no longer owned Supreme. Despite this fact, VF Corporation made it clear that he would still be involved. In a statement made about the acquisition, they wrote that the Supreme brand's founder, James Jebbia, and the senior leadership team of the brand will remain with the company headquartered in New York City, New York. As you can see, this statement was a bit vague. It didn't really describe what his role would be moving forward, and that had fans worried. Nevertheless, the deal was done. While the exact terms of the sale aren't known, James's net worth after it went through was estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 million. Not too bad for selling a company that he had started with just $12,000. So clearly, the sale to VF Corporation was controversial, largely for the same reasons that the sale to the Carlyle Group was controversial. And unfortunately, this was the beginning of a somewhat tumultuous period in the brand's history. For starters, in early 2023, Supreme announced that the store on Fairfax would be closing permanently as they relocated to a larger store on Sunset Boulevard. As we've discussed, the store on Fairfax was seen by many as the epicenter of LA's streetwear community, and as dismayed as people were about Supreme leaving, the real fear was what effect this would have on the neighborhood. Unfortunately, the worst of those fears seem to have come true. Nowadays, Fairfax is a shadow of its former self, and even if Supreme's departure was a consequence of the neighborhood's decline rather than the cause, there is no denying that this decision added fuel to the fire. This left many fans questioning what respect, if any, Supreme had left for the streetwear community, something they had been growing more and more skeptical about ever since the unceremonious closing of the store on Lafayette Street. In 2022, Supreme tried laying some of these questions to rest by hiring Tremaine Emory as the brand's new creative director. Tremaine Emory is a bona fide streetwear legend, having consulted for and collaborated with some of the biggest brands including Off-White, Yeezy Brand, Stussy, and perhaps more famously, having founded the clothing line Denim Tears as well as the creative collective No Vacancy Inn. Funnily enough, Tremaine recalls that when he was younger, he was never really that into Supreme, but he was into streetwear and spent much of his time hanging around at the Union shop in Soho. Through this, he got to know James Jebbia, and because Tremaine had some retail experience from working at places like Barney's New York and Saks Fifth Avenue, James was actually interested in hiring him to work at Stussy. But according to Tremaine, every time that he and James agreed to meet to discuss this, James would miss the meeting. Not content to wait around, he decided to apply for a role at Marc Jacobs in London instead, and he got the job. Tremaine quickly found success at Marc Jacobs, befriending the man himself and even stepping into a managerial position after a certain point. But after 9 years of this, he returned home to focus on more self-directed projects like the ones I mentioned earlier. And it was through these types of projects that Tremaine became one of the most well-connected people in the industry. Kanye West, Virgil Abloh, A$AP Rocky, and Frank Ocean are just a few of the names that were seeking Tremaine's input for their own projects. And while much of his work was done behind the scenes, he quietly established himself as one of the most highly sought-after creative consultants. After launching his own label Denim Tears in 2019, he emerged onto the scene as a creative director as well. It was the cotton-wreath denim jeans that really put the brand on the map, but since then, the product offering has expanded significantly. Denim Tears has even done a number of high-profile collaborations over the years, including ones with Dior, Virgil Abloh, Levi's, Stussy, UGG, and Cactus Plant Flea Market, just to name a few. So when you take into account his revered status in the streetwear industry, his affinity for collaborations, and his track record of success as a creative director and consultant, Tremaine seemed like the perfect person to lead Supreme. So in 2022, when it was announced that he would in fact become Supreme's next creative director, it gave many fans hope that the brand was finally getting back on track. But unfortunately, those hopes would be short-lived. Tremaine's first collection for Supreme, the Spring-Summer 2023 collection, debuted in early 2023, and most people agreed that this was a strong debut. There may not have been any instant classics, so to speak, but the collection demonstrated his ability to balance Supreme's core aesthetic with his own personal flair for high-end streetwear. He carried this momentum into his second collection for Supreme, the Fall-Winter 2023 collection, but as it turns out, this second collection would also be his last. You see, in August of 2023, the very same month that this collection was released, Tremaine abruptly resigned from his role as creative director. Taking to Instagram, he explained that he had made this decision after learning that corporate executives at Supreme had canceled his collaboration with artist Arthur Jafa without telling him. Jafa's artwork is, among many things, known for its evocative imagery, and this collaboration appears to have been centered around his depictions of the brutalities of slavery. Tremaine believed that this collaboration would offer meaningful commentary on an important subject, but it seems that the Supreme execs didn't see it that way. Presumably, they believed that the imagery was too evocative and that it would turn into a PR nightmare. But to Tremaine, this excuse was evidence of what he called, and I quote, a lie to hide the systemic racism that lies deep within Supreme. Now, an important thing to note here is that in his post, Tremaine does mention that after resigning, James Jebbia stopped by his house in person to talk about what had happened. He explains that James took responsibility for not telling him about the decision to scrap the collab, and that he promised to change things moving forward. To top things off, he even posted screenshots of their text messages after that conversation, and there doesn't appear to be any bad blood. The two of them clearly have respect for one another, and that's great, but this whole controversy shined a light on something that Tremaine had been piecing together for some time now. He was not the creative director of Supreme. James was. In a later interview with Complex's Noah Callahan-Bever, Tremaine reflects on this saying, James couldn't let go. He would never admit that he was creative director of Supreme, but he has been for 30 years. He is, to me, one of the best creative directors in fashion and design of all time. But when it came time for him to give up the reins, he did not do that. I don't think he understood psychologically what it was to truly let go of it and let someone else run it. And that's exactly how we ended up in a situation where the new creative director of Supreme had his own collaboration canceled without having a say in the decision or even knowing about it. I do wish that Tremaine had been given more creative license during his tenure, because he is an incredibly talented director and could have helped grow the brand in new and exciting directions, which is exactly what they hired him for in the first place. But I will say that as unfortunate as the circumstances were, many fans were pleased to learn that James Jebbia was still so heavily involved with Supreme. After the acquisition by VF Corporation, we knew that he would still be working with the brand in some capacity, but most people assumed that he had taken a step back from day-to-day operations, that he had somehow faded into the background. But according to Tremaine, that was not the case. So in a strange, roundabout way, this gave many fans hope that Supreme was not too far gone. Clearly things had changed, and as James himself admitted in his conversation with Tremaine, some of those things needed to be fixed. But the point is that he was still there and willing to fix them. Since Tremaine's departure in 2023, Supreme has not named a new creative director. As has always been the case, the brand does have a team of designers, but from what we can tell, the only man in charge is James. Whether he's finally grown more comfortable with his unofficial role as creative director, or is simply taking the time he needs to find the right successor, it's not entirely clear. But what is clear is this: whatever the future holds for Supreme, James Jebbia will be there to guide it. In July of 2024, VF Corporation sold Supreme to EssilorLuxottica, a European conglomerate known for its portfolio of eyewear companies including Oakley and Ray-Ban. EssilorLuxottica paid $1.5 billion to acquire the brand, which you may notice is $600 million less than VF Corporation had paid for it just 4 years earlier. So what went wrong? In a statement about the sale, VF Corporation CEO Bracken Darrell spoke about Supreme, saying, "Given the brand's distinct business model and VF's integrated model, our strategic portfolio review concluded that there are limited synergies between Supreme and VF." Translation: VF Corporation's core strength was high-volume manufacturing and distribution, which didn't work well with Supreme's low-supply, high-demand business model. It seems like VF might have initially overvalued Supreme, assuming that they could raise supply to meet the intense demand that had attracted them to the brand in the first place. But by the time they realized that flooding the market would actually hurt demand for Supreme, it was already too late. And hey, props to them for not acting out of desperation when they realized that things weren't working. This could have been the start of Supreme stores at shopping malls and new box logos in every collection. But that didn't happen. I do wonder if James negotiated restrictions on this type of thing during the sale, but whatever the case may be, VF decided that the most logical move was for them to offload Supreme from their portfolio. That's how it ended up in EssilorLuxottica's portfolio, and at the time of writing, that's where it remains today. And for the most part, the business strategy has remained the same, with a heavy emphasis on expanding Supreme's geographical footprint. We last talked about Supreme opening a store on Sunset Boulevard back in 2023. Since then, they had also opened stores in Seoul, Korea, Shanghai, China, and Miami, Florida. And just recently, in February of 2026, they ran one of their largest marketing campaigns ever on the Sphere in Las Vegas, Nevada, leading to speculation that a store could be coming to the Strip sometime in the near future. And I actually want to pause on this for a second. When I say that this was one of Supreme's largest marketing campaigns ever, I mean that both literally and figuratively. At approximately 160,000 square feet, the Sphere is the largest LED screen in the world. And for a brand that has historically strayed away from mainstream marketing channels, you could say that the campaign was somewhat uncharacteristic for Supreme. However, the video that played on the screen was very characteristic for Supreme. Titled Taco Zone and directed by Oliver Payne, it's essentially just a CGI-infused skate video featuring guys in digital ski masks skating around and eating tacos. And that's what I love most about this marketing campaign. It's not even promoting anything. It's taking this cutting-edge format, the Sphere, and applying the same guerrilla-style marketing that Supreme built its reputation on. It literally feels like a group of skaters hacked into the sphere so that they could show off their tricks on the big screen. Now, of course, this was not guerrilla marketing. I'm sure that they had to pay an exorbitant amount for the screen time. But the point is that they're beginning to figure out how to adopt new avenues for brand growth and marketing while still holding on to the things that make Supreme Supreme. Perfecting this balance will likely be one of the brand's primary focuses over the next few years, and it's going to be a challenge, but I'm optimistic that it can be done. And some would argue that it has to be done. You see, in recent years, there has been this growing narrative that Supreme is dead. There is an endless supply of articles and YouTube videos online proclaiming exactly that, and many streetwear fans will tell you the same thing. But what do they actually mean? Well, Supreme's financials are rarely, if ever, made public. But back when they were owned by VF Corporation, some of those financials were made public, and they didn't look great. In 2023, the year before the brand was sold to EssilorLuxottica, Supreme's revenue apparently dropped by as much as 7%. But even more telling is that VF reported a $735 million impairment charge due to Supreme's underperformance. Impairment charge is the accounting term for when companies write off significant depreciation in the value of their assets. So in other words, in the eyes of VF Corporation, Supreme's value had plummeted. Now obviously there are other factors at play here. The value of a company is a subjective thing, and 2023 financial data is only one small indication of the brand's performance. So to give us a more comprehensive view, I used Google Trends to depict fluctuations in search interest related to the brand Supreme from 2004 to present, and the results are clear as day. Since peaking in 2017, the year of the Louis Vuitton collaboration, search interest in Supreme has declined rapidly. And to be clear, reaching zero on this chart obviously does not mean that searches have dropped to zero. It just means that the current search interest is a small percentage of what it was at its peak. So what are we supposed to do with this information? Are people onto something when they say that Supreme is dead? Personally, I think that the answer is no, and I'll explain why. Today, people tend to compare Supreme not against other streetwear brands, but against its former self. And this perspective fails to appreciate just how much of an anomaly Supreme was when it was at its peak. Collections selling out in fractions of a second, people sleeping on sidewalks just for a chance to buy something, $40 t-shirts reselling for thousands of dollars, billion-dollar companies lining up for collaborations, the list goes on and on. The fashion industry had never seen anything like this before. People were lining up for box logos the same way that they were lining up for the new iPhone. But even that comparison doesn't do justice to the sheer mania that we were witnessing. And yes, over the years, that mania has subsided. But that's to be expected. You see, there was a novelty factor to Supreme, but there was also a novelty factor to streetwear culture. And the novelty factor of both Supreme and streetwear culture dissipated around the same time, creating this effect where it felt like Supreme had fallen off. But in reality, they were experiencing the same downturn that the rest of the streetwear industry was experiencing. The only difference is that new brands emerging onto the scene still had the benefit of being novel, at least for a period of time. And during that period, those brands may have taken attention away from Supreme, which explains why the public's perception of the brand is the way that it is today. But I would contend that that perception is not consistent with reality. Like I said, they do not publish their financial results, but if I had to guess, I would say that by the numbers, Supreme is still today the most popular streetwear brand in the world. And honestly, I bet it's not even close. Collections are still selling out within seconds, they're doing more high-profile collabs than ever before, and as we just discussed, they're opening more and more stores every year. Let's also not underestimate the opening of the Shanghai store back in 2024. China has historically been one of the largest markets for fake Supreme, and now that there's a real location there, they may be tapping into one of their largest audiences yet. And to people who say, but it's just not the same, I hear you. I feel it too. But to challenge your own biases, I encourage you to look at Supreme's most recent collection, and then look at a random collection from 10 plus years ago. Chances are that they're incredibly similar, and that's not a knock on Supreme. It's a testament to the fact that despite all of the changes that the brand has been through, the clothing has remained surprisingly consistent. Just as we talked about earlier when I said that the 4 tees weren't all that different from tees that Supreme might release today. And sure, there have been some lackluster collections along the way, but my point is that Supreme has been consistent for so long now that nostalgia is kicking in. We think that the old collections are better because we fell in love with those collections when Supreme was at its peak, but the reality is that the designs are largely the same. And here is where we arrive at the plight of all Supreme fans. They don't want the brand to change, but deep down, they're desperate for something new. And honestly, this is why I thought that bringing in an outsider like Tremaine Emory would be so positive. That someone as talented as him coming in and shaking up the status quo would help fans appreciate change rather than resent it. But as we know, things didn't pan out that way. And today, the question of what the future holds for Supreme is for James Jebbia and James Jebbia alone to answer. At the beginning of it all, James was just another kid, seeking an outlet for his creative energy. And when he finally found fashion, he was willing to do anything to be around it, even if that meant moving to America to stock shelves for minimum wage. He eventually took a chance by opening his own store, Union, and that led to him working with Sean Stussy, which eventually led to him opening Supreme. What started out as a tiny skate shop in Soho is now one of the most iconic brands in the world. And while he had some help along the way, it was James's drive, ambition, and relentless commitment to being the best, dare I say, to being supreme, that led the brand to where it is today. And for as long as James Jebbia is at Supreme, I trust that that same drive, that same ambition, and that same relentless commitment will lead the brand wherever it goes next. Regardless of what that looks like, I hope that this video has helped you appreciate what it once was and how it came to be. It truly is an amazing story, and I'm confident that there will never be another quite like it. But remember, just because the story's been told does not mean that the story is finished. If we've learned anything about James Jebbia, it's that he always has a plan. And who knows? That plan may very well be for the next great chapter in the history of Supreme.